Hello, everyone. Welcome to a podcast about a podcast. Today, we are looking at the podcast Dead Meat, which is an extension of the YouTube channel Dead Meat. It is two YouTubers and social media creators who are engaged, and they just really love horror movies and the horror genre. So what we'll be discussing today is the identification and the success of their podcast, how that is achieved through identification, through their interpretation of films and horror genre works, as well as talking about ownership and how just two people who are just fans of some horror movies are able to own authorship in their interpretations and opinions of these works.
What do you think?
I think we're dead meat. Real dead meat.
Go ahead and laugh, you guys. If I ever find a little bastards that did this, they're dead meat.
Welcome to the Dead Meat Podcast, an extension of the YouTube channel Dead Meat. I'm James.
I'm Chelsea, and we're engaged, and we like to get scared together.
So I think what draws me to this podcast, a little background on how I found them, was through their YouTube channel and their analysis of horror. I do believe the horror genre is very good at exploring topics or ideas that could be considered taboo, or even just using the scope of different subgenres of horror to explore the self and explore the inner workings of the mind or of society. However, I do not have the stomach for a lot of gorier horror. I'm definitely very much a scaredy cat when it comes to extended scenes. So I did feel like I was missing out a tad in learning about certain works, and Dead Meat was just one of those channels that not only walked you through different horror works, but also offered their interpretation and analysis. And I thought that was very cool. I thought there was a lot of effort that went into their podcast, not just from a production standpoint, but also from content. They research their interviews. They just do a lot of work to make sure that what they're saying is not ignorant and just the ramblings of two fans, though I do think that they are interesting enough people that they could carry the show just on their interpretation alone. But that being said, that comes to identity. I'll start very basic. Kenneth Brooke, I apologize for any of the name pronunciations. Rhetoric of Motives. He talks about identification as division, and to unite under one thing is to divide something else. Why I bring up this kind of very basic foundation about identification is this is a channel about horror. They do not branch out into a lot of different topics in their podcast. It is all about the horror genre. Or like different horror works, so the haunted mazes at Universal Studios, or urban legends about movie sets, things like that. But it is this identification of this is who we are unapologetically, that I feel can be distancing for some viewers, but I think in that way it succeeds to try to relate to as many people as possible, especially online. It can be, in this day and age, it can make content creators who are doing these kinds of interpretations or analysis seem very shallow and not to be putting too much thought and effort as they kind of like tiptoe around making sure that everyone can identify with a piece of what they're building. But this unapologetic nature of the Dead Meat podcast, I feel, does lend to the division, but also the identification of why their channel has succeeded. There's also a big problem with their podcast is on Spotify, but it's also on YouTube, and censorship in YouTube. Trying to keep it monetizable. I feel like their unapologetic nature, I don't know if it has hurt them with their monetization of their podcast, but it has definitely, it's refreshing to see in an atmosphere and climate on the site where a lot of people are tiptoeing around, curse words or controversial material. And a lot of, like I said, horror is just uncensored material, uncensored works. So yeah, it's been very refreshing to see, and I think that puts like the foundation of identification. Moving forward, we are looking at Subversive remix Rhetoric of Saved by the Bell Hooks. This, I like to point out, I think there were some interesting quotes discussed in here that could really help with the identification that Chelsea and James, the two hosts, build on the podcast. So going off of what is mentioned in the article, from what I interpret as it is by someone taking a genre or a work and just talking about it or spreading it around, giving recommendations to view a film, for example. You're creating your own meaning to it, and I do believe that James and Chelsea, though they try to cite sources of the director's meaning of things and the actor's interpretation, they are, in a sense, writing their own book of horror rhetoric and horror stereotypes and what makes a successful horror film and what doesn't make a successful horror film. From the article, there was a quote I wanted to read from Kyle Larson, and it states, "As individuals choose to spread genres, their identities are also remade, or perhaps more accurately, simply continue to be made in a never-finished process of identity making. Individuals who choose to take up a genre by spreading it perform the acts of interpretation and meaning making." So, I'll just break this down for you guys here. But basically what I'm seeing in applying this to the Dead Meat podcast is them just wholeheartedly sticking to the horror genre. And that is day in and day out what they are talking about, because that is something that interests them and they are clearly passionate about in their show. They are, in a sense, remaking the personas of themselves that they put online. They started off as boyfriend and girlfriend who like to get scared together. They later went on to be engaged, and now their little intro is slightly different, as you heard in the start of the podcast. But yeah, they are growing and changing as people in the real world, but because they are working with a genre that is still very much alive, and some could argue is going through a renaissance period right now, they are remaking their own identities as they continue to discuss and expand their knowledge about this. And I think that's what makes this podcast so effective, is as the environment for the horror community and the viewers themselves watch new movies or expose themselves to new horror content. They as well are, by sharing their opinion, changing and adapting with the genre. So I think that does make the podcast more effective in identification, by the sense that they are working with an ever-changing environment and they're able to stay relevant, and that is able to keep their viewership up. Yeah, so I do think that plays a large part in James and Chelsea's podcast and the success of that podcast. Moving on, I want to mention Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and kind of break down some notes I had from there that I do think apply to the success of this podcast and the success of Dead Meat as a whole. So Benjamin does mention in his piece how ownership and reproduction of works of art, which I'm counting horror movies and films as such works of art in this case, their ownership and how they are changed by the physical analysis of today. It creates a reproduction of the original. So viewing movies in the past versus now, the change in censorship, the change in meaning that they have, is something I wanted to touch on. Not only are Chelsea and James taking these works and giving them their own interpretation, therefore taking ownership of the work through that lens, I do think it is, in a sense, a reproduction of that work. So they did a 2-part episode on evil children and the trope of evil children throughout horror movies, starting with the Bad Seed in the mid-50s and running to the Babadook in 2012. I believe 2012. They took like the movie The Exorcist, and that has a lot of religious undertones, and that has a lot of, there's the whole idea that it's a story about sexuality or the fears of growing up, things like that. And that's one interpretation of it, but James and Chelsea specifically looked at it as the trope of the horrid child, and the fear of motherhood. And in that sense, when they released that podcast, they took ownership of that specific version or interpretation of the Exorcist film, and that is now like their intelligent property. Moving on to another thing Walter Benjamin mentions is he says, at any moment, the reader is ready to turn into a writer, an expert which he had become willy-nilly in an extremely specialized work process. Even if only some minor respect, the reader gains access to the authorship. So that was a quote from Walter Benjamin. But what I think this pertains to my point about the ownership of interpretation, especially today in social media where everyone has a microphone and everyone has a camera, and some way, some app to edit what they want and complete what they need to. Chelsea and James are in no way different from just viewing the podcast. They come off as the regular Joe Schmoes, just regular people who enjoy horror, and they build onto that. Now, outside of the podcast, I know James has a career in acting. He's been in some horror TV shows and horror shorts. Chelsea, I'm not entirely sure what all her background is. I do believe there is a background in writing, so they are creative people, and to an extent, work in the horror field. But the way they frame themselves in the podcast, for identification purposes, they are just the same as any other listener tuning in who is fascinated or excited about the horror genre. So going back to what Benjamin talked about, a reader is ready to turn into a writer. They are not discussing their own work. They are specifically reacting to current works, previous works. They'll have guests on there who were in productions similar to the ones that I know James are in, but at no point is he going, well, from my experience in working in the field or my experience in being a part of this horror show or this horror movie. It is specifically the reader becoming a writer. They are creating their interpretations based solely on them being the audience. I think it kind of brings the Rhetoric situation around full circle, because the audience is now turning around and teaching another audience. And I think in that sense, they aren't preaching from an academic standpoint of this is what interpretation is, this is what the analysis is, this is what this story means. And they aren't teaching from like a professional standpoint, like I am a professional director, kind of similar to those masterclass commercials where they were like, well, John Williams is a music producer and he'll teach you how to do music because he's a professional. They are specifically saying we are the audience. We do not own the rhetoric. We are offering an interpretation of the rhetoric. But in an ironic sort of sense, they themselves are creating their own intellectual properties and speeches and kind of bringing it full circle. And then to take it another step further, kind of a meta commentary, this right now is me preaching to an audience, me discussing my analysis of the Dead Meat podcast and interpretation of their work. So yeah, this is just a very brief analysis of it. I truly do enjoy their podcast. They make it extremely interesting, so I definitely would recommend checking them out. I'll link them down below, but thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. If you like it, I will be interested in doing some more reviews about podcasts or other things. But once again, thank you for listening to a podcast about a podcast, the Dead Meat podcast analysis. So thank you again.
This is everything with you right next to me, so alive, and tonight